She told the whole church she quit her job for Mom, whose name is on every single appointment record. My name is Cordelia Washburn. I'm 40 years old, and I work as a medical billing auditor here in Birmingham, Alabama. I spend my days doing something that sounds, to most people outside the field, almost aggressively boring. Reconciling claim codes. Verifying that what a clinic billed actually matches what was documented during a visit. Flagging discrepancies between what a chart says happened and what an insurance company was asked to pay for. It's detail work. It's invisible work. Nobody has ever once told me at a party that my job sounds fascinating, but it has given me one specific skill that turned out, in the worst year of my family's life, to matter more than almost anything else I own. An absolute, boned instinct for noticing when a record doesn't match the story being told about it. Like, subscribe the channel, and tell us in comments from where you are watching this video. I want to tell you about my sister Tamsin, and about our mother, and about a year in which one of us did the work of caring for a dying woman, and the other did the work of being seen caring for her. And about the morning I sat in my car in a church parking lot with a printout in my lap, trying to decide whether telling the truth out loud was an act of justice or an act of cruelty, and deciding, finally, that it could be both, as long as I did it quietly enough. I should tell you about my mother first, because she's the actual center of this story, even though most of what I'm about to describe happened around her rather than to her directly. Though, of course, in the end, everything that happened to her caregiving arrangement had to her too, whether she understood it or not. Our mother, Delphine Washburn, raised Tamsin and me alone in a small house in the Ensley neighborhood of Birmingham, working as a school cafeteria manager for almost 30 years. She is, even now, even sick, one of the most quietly dignified people I have ever known. A woman who never once, in my entire childhood, raised her voice in anger, who fed half the neighborhood's children out of a kitchen that barely had enough for her own 2 daughters, who has belonged to the same Baptist church on the same corner for 41 years and has never missed more than a handful of Sundays in all that time, even through 2 bouts of pneumonia and a hip replacement. I think it's worth saying, too, that our mother built her whole identity, in many ways, around that church, not in some performative sense. In the deep, structural way, certain people's entire social architecture gets built around a single institution over 40 years. Her closest friends were church friends. Her sense of being known, being seen, being cared for in her community ran almost entirely through that congregation, which meant that when she got sick, the way that community responded to her illness, who got praised for caring for her, who got prayed over, whose sacrifice got named from the pulpit, mattered to her far beyond the practical question of who was actually driving her to appointments. It mattered to her sense of whether her life's investment in that community had been worth it, whether her daughters loved her in the visible, narratable way her church friends' daughters seemed to love them. I think that emotional stake is part of why this whole situation took root and grew the way it did before anyone moved to correct it. 18 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with a progressive autoimmune condition that, over the following year, steadily eroded her mobility and her stamina, turning what used to be simple errands, a trip to the pharmacy, a grocery run, a visit to her own doctor, into events that required planning, patience, and increasingly, someone physically present to help her in and out of a car, to sit with her through appointments, to remember which medications interacted badly with which foods, to advocate for her when a new specialist needed convincing that her pain was real and not, as one particularly dismissive physician's assistant suggested early on, simply a normal part of aging. Tamsin and I are 4 years apart. She's older, 41. And we have, for most of our adult lives, occupied very different positions in our mother's orbit, in ways that I think set the stage for everything that came later, long before our mother ever got sick. Tamsin married young to a man named Russ who works in commercial real estate, and the two of them built a life that looks, from the outside, considerably more comfortable than mine. A 4-bedroom house in Vestavia Hills, 2 kids now mostly grown, a kind of effortless social visibility that comes from being involved in everything. The PTA, the neighborhood association, and especially centrally, our mother's church. Tamsin has spent 2 decades cultivating a reputation as one of the most devoted, generous, dependable women in the congregation. I never married. I live about 15 minutes from our mother's house in a modest apartment that I chose, in part specifically because it put most enough to get to her quickly if something went wrong. I've worked the same demanding, unglamorous job in medical billing for 12 years. I don't go to church much anymore, a fact that Tamsin has mentioned, pointedly, more than once over the years, in a tone that always seemed to be doing more work than the words selves. I am not, by the standards of our mother's social world, a particularly visible person. I don't organize meal trains. I don't speak up during prayer requests. I am, in the specific currency our family's church community trades in, public displays of devotion, the kind of sacrifice that gets named out loud and prayed over, almost entirely invisible. What I am, instead, is the person who has driven our mother to every single one of her medical appointments for the past year. Every one. And I want to say, clearly before I go any further into this story, that I didn't do that for credit, and I didn't do it expecting anyone to notice. I did it because she's my mother, and because somebody had to. And because, this part matters, Tamsin, for reasons I didn't fully understand until much later, was never available to do it herself. About 10 months ago, on a Sunday morning, Tamsin stood up during the prayer request portion of our mother's church service and announced, in a voice that I'm told carried real emotion, that she had made the difficult decision to leave her job. She'd been working part-time at a boutique marketing firm, helping small businesses with their social media, in order to become our mother's full-time caregiver. She talked about the sacrifice involved, the financial strain it would put on her family, the way she'd prayed on the decision for weeks before finally accepting that this was what God was calling her to do. She asked, not directly but in the gentle, practiced way church communities understand, without needing things spelled out, for the congregation's support and prayers during what she described as an exhausting, all-consuming season of caregiving. I wasn't there that Sunday. I learned about it secondhand, the way I learned about most of what happened inside that church over the following 10 months, through my mother mentioning it afterward in the kind of offhand way that made it clear she didn't fully grasp the significance of what had just been said in front of 200 people, her behalf. Tamsin told everyone at church she quit her job to help take care of me. My mother said to me over the phone that evening, sounding faintly puzzled rather than moved, I didn't realize she'd done that. That's awfully kind of her to say. I remember pausing on the other end of that call, because something about the sentence didn't sit right immediately, even before I'd had time to think through exactly why. Tamsin and I had spoken, just 2 weeks earlier, about scheduling for our mother's upcoming round of specialist appointments. A conversation that had ended, as most of our scheduling conversations did by that point, with Tamsin citing a work conflict and asking if I could just take this one too. If she'd actually quit her job to care for our mother full-time, that conversation should have gone very differently. There should have been no work conflict to cite. There should have been, if anything, Tamsin asking me to step back, to let her take over the bulk of the appointments now that she had the time freed up for exactly that purpose. I didn't say anything to my mother that night beyond some non-committal acknowledgement, but I started paying closer attention, in a way I hadn't quite let myself do before, to the actual distribution of effort happening around my mother's care. Not because I was looking for a fight, because something in that single phone call had planted a question I couldn't fully shake. I want to be precise here, because precision is the entire engine of this story, and I think it matters that I lay out exactly what I observed over the following months, rather than simply asserting that Tamsin was lying, because for a while, I genuinely wasn't sure myself whether I was watching dishonesty or just an uneven, frustrating, but ultimately well-intentioned distribution of caregiving labor between two sisters with very different schedules. Tamsin had, in fact, left her part-time marketing job. That part of her announcement was true, as far as I could ever determine, and I want to give her that much credit, because I think conflating an actual fact with the larger fabrication built around it would be its own kind of dishonesty on my part. What was not true, or at minimum was radically overstated, was the second half of her claim, that she had left that job specifically to become our mother's full-time, hands-on caregiver, and that the resulting caregiving labor was now primarily falling on her. In the 10 months following her church announcement, I continued doing essentially everything I had already been doing before it. Driving our mother to every medical appointment, sitting with her through blood draws and specialist consultations, and a fairly grueling round of physical therapy, evaluations, managing her medication schedule, fielding the increasingly complicated insurance paperwork that came with a chronic, escalating condition. And yes, doing all of this while also working my own full-time job, which I had not quit, and which I had no realistic ability to quit, because, unlike Tamsin's household, mine didn't have a second income from a husband in commercial real estate to absorb the loss. I remember one specific week, about 6 months into this arrangement, that crystallized for me more clearly than any single conversation could have. My mother had a particularly difficult round of appointments that week. A rheumatology follow-up on Tuesday, a blood draw on Wednesday, a physical therapy evaluation on Thursday, and an unplanned visit to urgent care on Friday after a bad reaction to a new medication. I took her to all 4, rearranging my own work schedule each time, using vacation hours I'd been quietly stockpiling specifically for situations like this. That same week, Tamsin posted on the church's private Facebook group a long, heart message about how caregiving fatigue had been weighing on her, accompanied by a photo of herself at the Bible study she led that Thursday evening, the same Thursday I'd spent 3 hours in a physical therapy, waiting for room. Several church members commented with prayer emojis and offers of support. Nobody in that comment thread had any way of knowing that the caregiving fatigue being described didn't map onto an actual caregiving schedule anyone could verify. Tamsin, meanwhile, visited our mother, by my own informal accounting, which I'll admit wasn't rigorous in those early months, because I had no reason yet to be keeping score, somewhere in the range, once or in a weekend, usually for an hour or two, usually bringing something thoughtful like a casserole or a new throw blanket, visits that were genuinely warm and pleasant in the moment, but that bore almost no resemblance to what a full-time caregiver's schedule would actually look like. She was, by every account I could gather, devoting a meaningful amount of her newly freed-up time to exactly the kind of church and community involvement she'd always been known for. Leading a women's Bible study that had grown significantly that year, organizing a fundraiser for a mission trip, becoming, if anything, more visible and more active in the congregation's social life than she'd been before quitting her job, not less. I want to sit with that contrast for a moment, because I think it's the part of this story people find hardest to fully absorb on first hearing it. It would be one thing if Tamsin had quit her job, tried genuinely to take on the caregiving role, and simply found herself, despite good intentions, unable to sustain it. Overwhelmed, burned out, gradually receding from a commitment that turned out to be harder than she'd anticipated. That's a sympathetic, human story, and if that's what had happened, I don't think I'd be telling you about it now. What actually happened was different, and I think considerably less sympathetic. Tamsin used the language of an enormous personal sacrifice to secure social standing, emotional support, and eventually material support from our church community, while the actual labor that language was supposed to describe continued falling entirely onto someone else. About 4 months into this arrangement, the financial dimension of it surfaced in a way that moved this, for me, from frustrating to something closer to alarming. Our church, a mid-sized congregation with a genuine, long-standing tradition of supporting members through hardship, has a benevolence fund administered by a small committee under the church's pastor, Pastor Darnell Holt, that's used to provide modest financial assistance to families going through documented difficulty, a member who's lost a job, a family facing a medical crisis, situations exactly like the one Tamsin had described from the pulpit. I learned, again secondhand, through my mother mentioning it with the same faintly puzzled tone she'd used about the original announcement, that the Benevolence Committee had approved a modest monthly stipend for not a huge sum, a few $100s a month, but a real, recurring disbursement of church funds, specifically framed as support for a member who had sacrificed her income to provide full-time caregiving for an ailing parent. I remember exactly where I was when Mother told me this. Standing in her kitchen, putting away groceries I'd just driven 40 minutes round trip to buy for her, because the closer store had been out of the specific low-sodium items her new diet required. I remember the specific, quiet jolt of anger that moved through me, not because a few $100s a month was an enormous sum in the abstract, but because of exactly what it represented: church members, many of whom had modest incomes themselves, contributing to a fund that was now compensating my sister for caregiving labor she was not actually performing, while the caregiving labor she was being compensated for continued to be done, unpaid and unacknowledged, by me. I didn't say anything to my mother in that moment. I want to be honest that part of my hesitation in those early months wasn't purely strategic patience. It was genuine uncertainty about how to even begin a conversation like that with a woman who was sick, exhausted, clearly proud of her older daughter's apparent sacrifice. My mother loved hearing that Tamsin had given something up for her. It made her feel, I think, less like a burden and more like a woman whose children loved her enough to rearrange their lives around her care. I wasn't sure, in those months, that I'd the right to take that feeling away from her, even though the feeling was built on something that wasn't true. What finally moved me from quiet discomfort to active investigation wasn't the stipend itself exactly. It was something smaller, almost incidental, that happened at work. I want to explain briefly the part of my job that ended up mattering most to this story. Medical billing auditing involves reviewing clinic documentation against what's been submitted to insurance. And one specific, unglamorous category of documentation that auditors like me look at constantly is the check-in and intake record for each visit, which, depending on the clinic system, frequently includes a field for accompanying party. The name of whoever brought the patient in, sat with them, and was available to receive instructions or sign off on care decisions. It's not a field most patients or families ever think about. It exists for the clinic's own coordination purposes, mostly to know who to address discharge instructions, who to call if there's a question after the visit. It's exactly the kind of small, administrative detail that becomes invisible the moment it serves its immediate purpose and gets filed away, until someone like me, doing an unrelated audit on an unrelated claim, happens to pull a chart and notice a pattern. I should say, too, that this field matters more than its boring name suggests, in ways most families never have reason to think about. Whoever is listed as the accompanying party, in practice, the person the clinic treats as the primary point of continuity for that patient's care, the person whose questions get answered first, whose understanding of the treatment plan the clinic assumes is accurate, the person who'd be called first in an emergency that happened between visits. It's a quiet, but real form of designated responsibility, distinct from but closely related to the kind of medical proxy authority that matters even more in a true crisis. In my mother's case, that responsibility had been mine, consistently, for almost a year, recorded in black and white 14 separate times, completely independent of anything anyone in our family had said out loud about who was supposed to be doing this work. I want to be completely transparent about how this happened, because the ethics of it matter, and I've thought about them carefully in the time since. I did not go looking for evidence against my sister. I did not log into my mother's clinic records with the specific intent of building a case. What happened was considerably more mundane. My employer, the billing audit firm I work for, had recently picked up a contract auditing claims for a small network outpatient clinics in the Birmingham area, and one of those clinics, entirely by coincidence, turned out to be the same rheumatology practice where my mother had been receiving the bulk of her specialist care for the past year. I flagged the conflict of interest immediately to my supervisor, the moment I recognized the clinic's name on an assigned batch of charts, exactly as I'm professionally and ethically required to do. Auditors aren't supposed to review claims involving their own family members, for obvious reasons, and I take that requirement seriously. Not as a formality, as something genuinely important to the integrity of the work. My supervisor reassigned my mother's specific claims to a colleague before I ever reviewed a single billing code attached to her care. But in the process of flagging the conflict, pulling up the clinic's patient roster briefly to identify which specific charts needed reassignment, I saw, entirely incidentally, a field on the intake summary screen that I wasn't even looking for. The accompanying party listed for each of my mother appointments over the past year. My name was listed every single time. 14 separate visits, going back 11 months, each one showing my name in that field. Cordelia Washburn, daughter, accompanying party, in the exact same standardized format the clinic used for every patient. Tamsin's name did not appear once. I closed that screen almost immediately, conscious of the boundary I'd already crossed by even glancing at it longer than the reassignment required, and I didn't think about it again that day in any active way. But it stayed with me, the way certain pieces of information do, sitting quietly at the edge of my attention for the following several days, until I found myself on a Saturday morning with nothing else occupying my mind, finally letting myself sit with the full weight of what 14 for 14 actually meant. I want to walk through my thinking carefully here, because I spent close to 3 weeks turning this over before I did anything with it, and I think the deliberation itself is worth describing honestly, because I don't think the decision to act was obvious or easy, even once I had what amounted to clear documentation of the gap between Tamsin's public story and the actual record. My first instinct, genuinely, was to confront Tamsin directly and privately, sister to sister, and give her the chance to either explain something I was missing or correct the record herself before anyone else got involved. I called her about a week after that Saturday morning of full realization, and I tried to raise it gently. I asked, without accusation in my voice, whether she'd thought about scaling back some of her church commitments now that she had more time freed up, since I knew Mom's appointments were getting more frequent, and I was starting to feel stretched, pretty thin trying to cover all of them myself. Tamsin's response, looking back, told me almost everything I needed to know about how she'd come to understand her own role in all of this. She said, with what sounded like genuine confusion rather than guilt, that she felt like she was doing so much already, praying for Mom constantly, leading the Bible study that had become such a source of community support for our mother's situation, organizing the meal train that brought food to our mother's house twice a week. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that caregiving looked different for different people, that not everyone's contribution had to look the same, that she felt the church community had really rallied around all of us during this hard season. At no point in that conversation did she mention driving our mother anywhere, sitting through an appointment, or doing any of the specific, physical, time-consuming tasks that actually constitute caregiving in the sense her church announcement had originally described. I hung up that call feeling something I can only describe as a strange, vertiginous kind of clarity. Tamsin was not, I came to understand, consciously lying in the simple sense of fabricating a story she knew to be false, and was deliberately maintaining. She seemed to genuinely believe that what she was doing, prayer, the Bible study, the meal train coordination, the emotional labor of being visibly, publicly invested in our mother's situation, constituted real caregiving, equivalent in some meaningful sense to the actual physical, logistical, medical work I was doing every week. I don't think this makes what happened less harmful. I think it might actually make it more insidious, because it meant Tamsin wasn't navigating a guilty conscience that might eventually crack under its own weight. She had built, instead, a genuinely held belief that let her receive credit, support, and money for sacrifice she sincerely believed she was making, even as the actual labor that sacrifice was supposed to represent kept landing, week after week, entirely on me. That realization is what finally moved me from frustrated patience toward action. If Tamsin had been consciously, deliberately defrauding our church community, I think there might have been a path toward a private resolution, an acknowledgement, an apology, a quiet course correction before anyone else needed to know. But a person who genuinely believes her own framing isn't going to course correct from a single phone call. She's going to need the actual record, laid out clearly in a context where the gap between story and fact becomes undeniable, even to someone determined not to see it. What finally pushed me from, I should probably address this at some point, to, I need to address this now, happened on a Sunday about after that phone call with Tamsin, when Pastor Holt, during the announcements portion of the service, repeated and expanded on Tamsin's original framing, in a way that made the whole situation considerably more public and considerably harder to quietly walk back later. I wasn't there that morning either. By this point in the story, I think, clear that my absence from regular church attendance had become, unintentionally, a kind of structural blind spot that let this entire situation develop, without me directly witnessing most of its public dimensions. But my mother told me about it that afternoon, again in that same faintly puzzled tone, mentioning that Pastor Holt had specifically thanked our sister Tamsin from the pulpit for her tremendous sacrifice in stepping away from her career to be the primary caregiver for her mother during this season, and had encouraged the congregation to continue supporting her as she carries this heavy, beautiful burden. He'd apparently also mentioned, in passing, that the Benevolence Committee was considering whether to extend her monthly stipend given how demanding the caregiving had become. I sat with that information for most of that evening, and crystallized for me, finally, wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly anger in it, but a clearer sense of scale than I'd had before. This was no longer a private misunderstanding between two sisters about how to divide an exhausting workload. It was now a pastor, a congregation, and a benevolence fund, all operating on the basis of a claim the clinic's own records directly contradicted, with real money and real social capital flowing toward someone who was not doing the work that money and capital were ostensibly compensating. I thought, too, about my mother, sitting in that pew, hearing her daughter praised from the pulpit for a sacrifice that wasn't actually happening, while the daughter who was actually doing the work sat 15 minutes away in an apartment, unmentioned, unprayed for, uninvolved in any of it. I don't think my mother fully understood, even then, the discrepancy at the heart of. She'd absorbed Tamsin's framing the same way the rest of the congregation had, without the specific professional vantage point I happened to have into the clinic's own documentation. But I understood it, and I decided that evening that I was no longer willing to let the gap between the story and the record simply continue widening on its own. I requested the formal visit history for my mother's rheumatology care the following week. Not through the improper channel, but through the same patient-authorized release process any family member can use. With my mother's implicit consent, which she gave readily once I explained, in general terms, that I wanted to put together a clear record of her care for our own family's reference. She didn't ask many follow-up questions. I don't think even then she fully grasped what I was building toward. The printout, when it arrived, was almost anticlimactic in its plainness, a simple, unembellished list of 14 visits over 11 months, each one showing the date, the provider, the visit type, and the accompanying party field glimpsed briefly months earlier, now laid out in full, unambiguous, official form. My name 14 times. Tam's name 0 times. I sat with that single sheet of paper at my kitchen table for a long time, feeling, oddly, less triumphant than I'd expected to feel, holding what amounted to clear, undeniable documentation of something I'd already known to be true for months. Mostly what I felt was tired, and a little sad, in a way that surprised me. I want to explain why I decided, ultimately, to bring that printout to Pastor Holt privately rather than to my mother, or to Tamsin again, or to the congregation directly, because I think the choice of audience mattered enormously to how this eventually resolved. I didn't want to confront Tamsin again myself, because our previous conversation had already shown me that a private sister-to-sister appeal wasn't going to move her. She had a framework that absorbed and neutralized that kind of challenge without requiring her to actually change anything. I didn't want to bring it to my mother directly because I genuinely worried about what it would do to her in her current fragile health. To learn in a sudden, raw way that one daughter's widely celebrated sacrifice for her had been substantially overstated, I wasn't sure her heart literally or figuratively, could absorb that kind of disillusionment gracefully, and didn't want to be the one who delivered it to her without a gentler path available. And I specifically did not want to bring it to the congregation directly, in some public reveal, because I understood, even in my anger, that the goal here was never to humiliate Tamsin in front of 200 people. The goal was to correct a material, factual error that was actively misdirecting real community resources and real prayer and real emotional support away from where they were actually needed. That left Pastor Holt, the one person positioned to absorb this information privately, verify it discreetly, and then quietly redirect the church support structures without needing to stage some public unmasking that would have served my anger far better than it would have served my mother. I called his office and asked for 15 minutes on a weekday away from any service or church event. He agreed without asking many questions, which I appreciated. I met with Pastor Holt on a Thursday afternoon in his small, book-lined office at the back of the building. The quiet, unhurried space that made it easier than I'd expected to say out loud something I'd been rehearsing in my head for almost a week. He'd been our family's pastor for almost 15 years, had baptized both Tamsin's children, had visited my mother in the hospital during hip replacement years earlier, sitting with her for an hour reading scripture when neither Tamsin nor I had been able to get there in time. I trusted him, generally, in the specific way you trust someone who has shown up consistently for your family over a long stretch of ordinary, undramatic years. And I think that trust is part of why I chose to bring this to him, rather than handling it some other way. I started by telling him plainly that I wasn't there to attack my sister, and that I genuinely believed she wasn't acting out of malice, that I thought she'd built a sincere belief about her own role in our mother's care, and that I wanted to fix a factual problem, not punish a person. I told him about my job, briefly, enough to establish why I happened to have access to the kind of documentation I was about to show him. I watched him listen with the specific, patient attentiveness I remembered from countless sermons over the years, nodding occasionally, not interrupting, letting me get all the way through my explanation before responding. And then I laid the printout on his desk and let him read it himself, in silence, for close to a full minute, rather than narrating its significance to him. I watched his expression change while he read, not dramatically, but in the specific, careful way of a man whose job has trained him to absorb difficult information without immediately reacting to it. He set the page down gently, the way you'd set down something heavier than its actual weight, and rubbed his temple once before looking back up at me. When he finally looked up, he asked me a single question, the same one I'd been asking myself for weeks. "Are you certain this is complete? Every visit, going back this far?" I told him yes, that I'd pulled the full authorized record directly from the clinic myself, with my mother's consent, and that I'd cross-referenced it against my own calendar for the same period, which matched exactly. I told him I understood this put him in a difficult position, and that I wasn't asking him to publicly denounce my sister or to do anything dramatic. I told him what I actually wanted was much smaller and much more specific. I wanted the church's support, the meal train, the stipend, the prayer focus, to start the actual situation quietly without requiring a public reckoning that would serve no one's healing. Pastor Holt sat with that for a long moment before responding, and what he said next told me I'd chosen the right person to bring this to. He told me he appreciated that I'd come to him privately rather than letting this surface some other way, and that he took both both responsibility to the congregation's resources and his responsibility to handle a delicate family matter with care rather than spectacle. He mentioned, with a kind of weary honesty I respected, that he'd seen versions of this before in 20 years of ministry. Not this exact situation, but the general pattern of a congregation flowing to whoever tells the most compelling story rather than whoever's doing the quietest, least visible labor, and that it troubled him every time it happened, because it meant the church's own instincts for compassion were being used against their actual purpose. He said he'd need to verify a few things on his end, and then that he wanted to have a private conversation with Tamsin himself, directly before doing anything else, which I told him was exactly right, and exactly what I'd hoped he'd say. I don't know everything that was said in the conversation Pastor Holt eventually had with Tamsin, because I wasn't there and didn't ask to be, that some of this needed to happen without me in the room. What I do know, from what filtered back to me afterward, partly from Pastor Holt himself, partly from changes I observed directly, is that the resolution unfolded carefully, deliberately, and with considerably more grace than I think the situation, in my angrier moments, had felt like it deserved. Pastor Holt met with Tamsin privately, showed her the same printout I'd shown him, and asked her directly to explain the discrepancy. I'm told, secondhand, so I hold this lightly, that Tamsin's initial response mirrored almost exactly what she'd told me on our phone weeks earlier. That her contribution looked different, that prayer and community leadership were a form of caregiving too, that she felt she'd been doing meaningful work even if it wasn't reflected on a clinic's intake form. I'm told Pastor Holt responded to this, gently but firmly, by pointing out that the church's benevolence fund had specifically been allocated on the understanding that she'd given up income to provide hands-on, full-time caregiving, a specific, material claim that the clinic's documentation simply didn't support, regardless of how meaningful her other contributions might genuinely be. I'm told, too, that he asked her a question that apparently landed harder than anything else in that conversation. Whether she'd ever actually told Cordelia, directly, that she was stepping back from the appointments specifically so that the church framing could hold together, or whether the framing had simply been allowed to exist alongside an unchanged division of labor, without either sister ever explicitly agreeing to it. I'm told Tamsin didn't have a clean answer to that question, and that the silence which followed it told him most of what he needed to know. The Benevolence Committee, within 2 weeks, quietly discontinued Tamsin's stipend, not through any public announcement or formal censure, but through what I understand was a simple administrative adjustment, the kind of quiet correction that happens inside church finance committees all the time, without anyone outside the committee ever needing to know the specific reason. I imagine, though I don't know for certain, that the committee members themselves were given some general, careful version of the situation, enough to justify the change in their own minds, without necessarily the full granular detail of 14 for 14 that I'd laid out for Pastor Holt. Directly. The meal train, which I learned had been organized under the explicit framing of supporting Tamsin's caregiving season, was quietly re-coordinated by its volunteer coordinator, a woman named Brenda who Pastor Holt spoke with directly, to instead be addressed, going forward, to our mother's actual household, with deliveries and check-ins redirected toward me as the contact person, since I was, after all, the one actually managing her day-to-day care and the one who could actually use a casserole on a Tuesday after a 12-hour stretch between my job and a doctor's appointment. Brenda called me herself, about a week after the redirection started, to ask, kindly, and without any apparent awareness of the larger backstory, whether Tuesdays or Thursdays worked better for deliveries given my work schedule. I remember being almost undone briefly by how ordinary and practical that phone call was. A woman sewing trying a casserole to the right house on the right day, entirely unaware that the question itself represented the quiet correction of something that had been wrong for almost a year. Pastor Holt never stood up and corrected the record from the pulpit in some dramatic, public way, and I want to be honest that some small part of me, in my angriest moments, had wanted exactly that. A clear, public reckoning that named what had happened and held Tamsin visibly accountable for it. But I came to believe, watching how the quieter version actually unfolded, that he'd made the right call. The people who needed to know, the benevolence committee, the meal train coordinator, the small circle of church leadership actually responsible for allocating support, knew and adjusted accordingly. The broader congregation simply experienced a gradual, unremarkable shift. Tamsin's name stopped coming up as often in prayer requests specifically tied to caregiving, the meal train quietly redirected, and life moved forward without anyone needing to publicly relitigate what had happened, including, crucially, my mother, who I'm fairly certain never learned the full scope of the discrepancy in any granular detail, and whose dignity I was, in the end, more invested in protecting than I was in winning some larger vindication for myself. Tamsin and I have not had an easy reconciliation, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend this resolved into some tidy, sisterly closeness it never actually achieved. She knows now that I was the one who brought the printout to Pastor Holt. He didn't tell her directly. The timing, combined with my earlier phone call to her about scaling back, made obvious enough that she didn't need to be told outright. We've spoken a handful of times since, in the months that followed, mostly in the practical, slightly clipped way two people speak when they're coordinating around a sick parent's needs without fully addressing the larger rupture sitting underneath the logistics. There was one conversation, about 2 months after everything settled, where she came closer than she ever had before to actually naming what had happened. We were standing in our mother's kitchen, waiting for a pot of tea to finish steeping, and she said, without quite looking at me, that she supposed she'd gotten caught up in how it felt to be needed that way. The prayers, the attention, the sense of being seen as the daughter who'd sacrificed everything, and that she hadn't let herself notice how little of the actual day-to-day weight she was carrying compared to what she was being thanked for. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't even strictly an admission. It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging the gap out loud, and I chose to receive it as something real rather than picking it apart for not going far enough. She has not apologized to me directly, in so many words, for the underlying situation, though I think, in her own way, she's tried to recalibrate her actual involvement since the stipend ended and the meal train redirected, taking our mother to 2 appointments herself in the months, which is 2 more than she'd taken in the entire previous year combined, and which I choose to receive as a genuine, if quiet, correction rather than a performance, because ultimately, giving people room to actually change is more useful than demanding a confession before I'll acknowledge the change itself. I drove past her on one of those 2 occasions, actually, pure coincidence, both of us heading to the same clinic parking lot at the same hour. And there was something almost surreal about watching her walk our mother in through the same doors I'd walked through 14 times alone, carrying the same insulated bag of approved snacks I always packed, having apparently absorbed at least that much from watching me do it for a year. My mother, for her part, never asked me directly what happened with the stipend or the meal train, and I never volunteered a detailed explanation. I think she noticed, in some general way, that things had shifted, that the casseroles started arriving with notes addressed to me instead of references to Tamsin's sacrifice, that Tamsin's name came up less often in the prayer requests she'd occasionally mention hearing about secondhand from friends. If she drew her own conclusions, she never voiced them to me, and I never pushed her to. I think some truths are more mercifully absorbed slowly, in the background, than delivered all at once in a single difficult conversation, especially to a woman already carrying as much as she was carrying that year. People who hear this story sometimes ask me whether I regret not confronting Tamsin more directly, more publicly, in a way that would have forced a fuller accounting from her rather than the quiet, partial course correction we actually got. I understand the impulse behind the question, and I've turned it over plenty of times myself in the months since. But I keep landing in the same place. The goal was never to make Tamsin suffer for what she'd done. The goal was to make sure the actual caregiving, the driving, the appointments, the medication management, the unglamorous day logistics of keeping a sick woman cared for, got recognized and supported accurately by the community that was, in good faith, trying to support it all along. I think about Pastor Holt's handling of this often, because I think it offers something close to a template for how to address this kind of quiet fraud without turning it into a spectacle that ultimately serves the accuser's anger more than the actual repair the situation needs. He verified the facts. He had the hard conversation privately with the person actually responsible. He adjusted the institutional response, the money, the meal train, quietly and proportionately, without requiring a public confession or a humiliating unmasking that would have given the whole congregation a story gossip about for months, at exactly the moment my mother most needed peace rather than drama surrounding her care. I think, too, about how easy it would have been for this to never surface at all. If my employer hadn't happened to pick up a contract with that specific clinic, if I hadn't happened to glance at a field on an intake screen I wasn't even supposed to be looking at for longer than a conflict of interest reassignment required. I don't think that makes what I found any less real or any less worth acting on. The truth doesn't become less true because it was stumbled into rather than deliberately hunted down. But it has made me more attentive, since then, to how much of caregiving's actual distribution within families goes entirely unexamined, simply because nobody happens to be looking at the right record at the right moment. Most families don't have a medical billing auditor for a daughter. Most discrepancies like this one never get caught at all. What I'd want anyone hearing this story from it isn't really a Tamsin specifically, or even about church benevolence funds specifically. It's about the broader, quieter pattern underneath all of it, that the people who do the actual unglamorous, physically and emotionally exhausting work of Chem1 are very often not the same people who get socially credited for it, and that the gap between those two things can grow for a remarkably long time before anyone with the right vantage point happens to notice it. I got lucky, in a strange way, that my particular vantage point happened to intersect with my particular family's particular crisis. Most people doing the real work of caregiving in their own families don't get that lucky. They just keep driving to the appointments, managing the medications, doing the work quietly, while somewhere else, someone else gets prayed for. My mother, for now, stable, not improving in any dramatic way, but holding steady on her current treatment plan, still attending the same church, Still beloved by the same congregation that once celebrated the wrong daughter's sacrifice without ever quite meaning to get it wrong. I still drive her every appointment. My name is still the only one on the intake form. And these days, when the casserole arrives on a Tuesday evening, it comes with a note addressed to me. Small, ordinary, and somehow, after everything, more meaningful than any stipend or prayer request ever was.